So we're recording now. Hello, everyone. I'm Abla Hasan. I teach Arabic language and culture at Nebraska University. And I'm very honored today. We have our very first guest speaker in Global Islam Current Debates Talk Series for fall 2021. We have with us Dr. Mun'im Sirry. We're so honored, Dr. Mun'im. Mun'im Sirry is Assistant Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School, 2012. He did his undergrad and graduate studies at the International Islamic University in Islamabad, Pakistan, and master's degree from the University of California, LA. His academic interest includes Quranic studies, interreligious relations, political theology, modern Islamic thought, and Southeast Asian religions and cultures. Along with Professor Gabriel Said Reynolds, he is the editor of journal Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. Sirry is the author of Scriptural Polemics, the Qur'an and Other Religions, Oxford, 2014. He is also the author of so many important papers and book chapters. Most recently, he published the book that we're reading as this book, Controversies over Islamic Origins, a very recent book, Cambridge Scholars, 2021. We're reading this very important book as a book for this class. And today, Dr. Mun'im, we're trying to go with you over, and this is the style of this course, Global Islam Current Debates, questions. We discuss questions that sound as if they're simple, but they're not simple at all. And we're trying with chapter 4 from your book to answer the question, who was Muhammad? And let me start with quoting you, and I'm reading from page 165. You say in this page in chapter 4, today, no serious scholars, even the so-called traditionalists, would accept the historical narratives of the Islamic tradition at face value. In addition to the traditional sources being late, approximately 150, 250 years after the Prophet's death, the Sira Maghazi corpus also includes theologically and even outright legendary materials. Although we have abundant sources produced since the early 9th century, a fact that has often been cited to support the idea that it requires a conspiracy theory to accuse early Muslims of inventing stories about their prophet, their sheer number does not diminish the fact that they are late, not to mention the ideological tendaciousness of these resources. Therefore, even traditionalist scholars encourage a critical approach to Islamic tradition. And one of the very early questions and comments I got from my class is a high appreciation, Dr. Mun'im, of your critical approach. Please tell us more about your critical approach to learning about Islam, about the Quran, and about the Prophet of Islam. And one comment before I start with you, you mentioned in the introduction of the book that this book is written for the public general reader. I take it as an essential read to professors of Islamic studies and Quranic studies as well.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Abla Hasan, for such kind introduction. And the problem with two excellent introduction is that it is difficult to live up to that expectation. So now I am in trouble. So let me share my lecture notes so everyone can see here. So, but it is truly, honored for me to share this class with you and your intelligent student, and my student here and I are so delighted for this opportunity, and I'm particularly, humble for the opportunity to introduce my most recent book. My research interests revolve around the Quran and tafsir studies, or tafsir mean Quranic exegesis. I'm also interested in Muslim-Christian relations. In addition to this class on religious freedom, I'm teaching a course on Islam and Christian-Muslim relations, as you mentioned in your introduction, that I also serve as a co-editor of the journal with that title, Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. So if you are looking for venue to publish your scholarly work, so please consider sending your academic journal to our journal. So friends, the reading for today's class is chapter 4 of my most recent book entitled Controversies of Islamic Origin. This book critically examines the way in which the emergence of Islam is presented in the Muslim sources, and how those traditional Muslim sources have been viewed by modern scholars. As you may know that in the past few years, there has been a growing interest in the academic study of the sources from which we learn about the life of the Prophet or the emergence of Islam in general. So even if you are interested in modern Islam or issues of global engagement with Islam, it is still necessary to have solid knowledge about early Islamic history. It would be difficult, I think, to understand issues facing the Islamic world today without a background knowledge of Islamic history, including how Islam take the form that we know it today. So in our course here on religious freedom, which we will examine problems of religious restriction in the Muslim world, we begin with some sort of introduction to Islam. We studied together the Quran, we studied Quranic message and its relation to the Bible, Quranic exegesis. We also studied prophetic statement and practice. And today we will study together the life of the Prophet. So I think I will say a few words about the reading, and I hope you enjoy reading it. I know it's not easy reading, and it's quite long. And we'll have some time for discussion. And of course, there are many things that we can discuss from the reading, but I will highlight few things that seem to fit with our class setting. So friends, this is our plan for today. We begin with this question: why do we study the biography of the Prophet? And then I will talk just briefly about important episode in Muhammad's life. But for the most part, perhaps we will talk about the sources from which we learn stories about Muhammad's life, and then what draw modern scholars in their scholarly debate. So those are issues that we will learn together. So let's begin with the first one. Why do we study the biography of the Prophet? So we already spent some time talking about the Quran, right? And we realized that the Quran is not an easy text to understand. It is quite difficult to understand the text of the Quran, primarily because it is not chronological. So as we know very well that the first verse or the first passages of the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad claimed to receive is not in the first chapter of the Quran, but rather in chapter 96, as we already know. However, Muslim scholars in the past come up with the idea that the Quran might be easily understood if we know something about the context in which certain passages were revealed. So scholars in the past, they developed specific genre. It's called occasion of revelation. It's called asbab an-nuzul in Arabic, in order to understand the context in which certain passages of the Quran were revealed. So in other words, that in order, or why we study the biography of the Prophet is because of its close connection with the Quran itself. So early Muslim scholars developed the idea that if we understand the Quran in light of Muhammad's life, it might be easier to understand its meaning. And therefore, scholars developed that part of the Quran, was revealed in Mecca and other part were revealed in Medina. So this is widely accepted among Muslims as a way of reading the Quran in light of Muhammad's life. Even among Western scholars, as you can see here, that the 19th century German scholar Theodor Noldecker also followed the same paradigm, traditional Muslim paradigm, reading the Quran in light of Muhammad's life. This typology, early Meccan, middle Meccan, and late Meccan, and then Medinan chapters of the Quran, was first introduced by early scholar, including Gustav Weil, but it was Noldecker who provide a clear criteria to distinguish between one stage from the other. Early Meccan, short, rhyme, apocalyptics. Middle Meccan mostly deal with the question of prophecy and reaction of those who oppose Muhammad call. And the late Meccan mostly deal with the question of reward or punishment, and also some aspect of liturgy. In the Medinan period, the Quran seemed to be less rhythmic and deal with regulation, legal aspect, as well as reference to biblical issues. So the issue here is that if the Quran is read in the light of prophetic life, then according to these scholars, that the Quran can be easily understood. So there is no question, even among critical scholars, skeptical scholars, as I discussed in the chapter, about the close connection between the biography of the Prophet and the Quran. But the problem is that how we can understand the close or intimate connection between the Quran and the life of the Prophet. That is the main issue. So skeptic would argue or perhaps ask an important question: what if the biography of the Prophet was itself written as a way of explaining certain verses of the Quran? So as you can see, that this question implicitly casts a doubt about the historicity of the sources from which we learn about the biography of the Prophet. So for these scholars, the sources of the biography of the Prophet, or the biography of the Prophet itself, is not independent of the Quran, but rather it is an elaboration of the Quranic text, in the sense that the biography is an exegesis of certain Quranic texts. So, and therefore, it is exegetical in nature, right? It is not the context in which certain passages were revealed, but rather it was an elaboration of certain texts of the Quran. So the question of the sources then becomes so important, both among those scholars who I identify as traditionalists, who have confidence in the reliability of the Muslim sources, as well as among skeptical scholars who argue that the sources from which we rely in our discussion of the biography of the Prophet are not reliable. So as you know from the reading, that Western scholars from quite early on were already interested in reconstructing the life of the Prophet on reliable sources. So as you can see from the reading, that one scholar that worth mentioning here is a British administrator in India in the 19th century, William Muir, who wrote a massive book in 4 volumes entitled The Life of Muhammad. It's 4 volumes, and he also wrote a book afterward with the same title, but he added the life of Muhammad from original sources. So you can see here that in the 19th century, some Western scholars attempt to reconstruct the life of the Prophet on the basis of what they considered as original sources, meaning that in the 19th century, scholars tend to put much trust in the reliability of the Muslim sources. We can also mention, 19th century French scholar, I mentioned here Ernest Renan, who basically argued that the birth of Islam is not shrouded in mystery in contrast to the emergence of other religions. He continues saying that unlike so many the world other religion, for instance, Islam was born in the full light of history, in which we know about the Islam founding prophet in quite detail. So you can see here how confident Renan concerning the reliability of the Muslim sources, that Islam, according to him, was born in the full light of history. What is also worth noting here is that Renan was one of the pioneers in the research on the historical Jesus, which is quite interesting, that he was doubtful about the sources to reconstruct the historical Jesus. However, he seemed to be quite confident that the Muslim sources are unlike the sources to reconstruct the historical Jesus. And this issue about whether or not we can know the historical Muhammad continue to draw the scholarly attention. So in the 1926, for instance, Arthur Jeffrey, as you can see here, he wrote an article entitled "The Quest of the Historical Muhammad." So perhaps he was the first person who used the term historical Muhammad. I couldn't find anyone before him who used this term, but he was very much influenced by the research on the historical Jesus, because about 20 years before him, there was German scholar Albert Schweitzer, who wrote a book about the historical Jesus. And Geoffrey, according to his own admission, that he wanted to imitate the work of Schweitzer on the historical Jesus. And about more than 50 years later, you can see F.E. Peters also published his article with the same title. However, writing in the 1990s, Peters seemed to cast a doubt about whether Islam was born in the full light of history as presented by Ernest Renan there. So according to Peters, that the full light of history has actually exceedingly clouded. So he began to cast a doubt about the reliability of the Muslim sources in their reconstruction of the life of the Prophet. So, but before we continue talking about the sources, perhaps maybe just briefly, we can say a few things about how the life of Muhammad is presented in the traditional Muslim sources. Just briefly, I can spend maybe less than 5 minutes here if I can. So the Muslim sources do not mention exactly the year in which Muhammad was born, but they do associate Muhammad's birth with the year of 11. So this year of 11 referred to the invasion of Abraha, a Christian king from Yemen, who, along with his army, which include one or more were elephant, marched toward the city of Mecca in order to destroy the Kaaba. So the Muslim sources often associate the birth of Muhammad with that very memorable events. other important event taking place during Muhammad's lifetime was his marriage with his first wife, Khadijah. And then when Muhammad reached the age of 40, he claimed to receive revelation. As I mentioned earlier, that the first 5 verses that Muhammad claimed to receive is not in the first chapter of the Quran, but rather in chapter 96. Soon after he claimed to receive revelation, which marked the beginning of his prophetic life, Muhammad, proclaimed the divine message, but he was mostly rejected by the people of Mecca, and then he decided to migrate from Mecca to Medina. It's more complicated than what I just presented, but that's basically, the reason why he decided, because most of his followers were persecuted while they were in Mecca. However, there are few things taken place before the migration, including the death of his wife, his only wife at the time, Khadijah, and also the death of his uncle, who protect him from the persecution of the Meccan people. And perhaps in order to comfort Muhammad, to entertain him at one night, according to the Islamic history, that he was taken on the night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem to the 7th heaven to meet with God. That very important event taking place during Muhammad's lifetime. And also, the visit of certain people from Medina in order to give allegiance or pledge to Muhammad in a place called Aqaba, a city outside Mecca. And then because of their assurance that Muhammad decided to leave Mecca and to stay in Medina, that migration is called Hijrah in Arabic, marked the beginning of Muhammad's success in his prophetic life. So the significance of this migration is evident from the fact that the Muslim world began their Islamic calendar from this event, which took place in 622. And the first thing that Muhammad did when he was in Medina was to solidify, his followers, whether they are the immigrant or they are the local resident of Medina, who often called as helpers or Ansar. And there were battles which we cannot discuss here, but perhaps one important aspect before the end of Muhammad's prophetic life was the peace agreement that Muhammad initiated between him and the people of Mecca. And a few years later, in 630, that the conquest of Mecca was completed. This is the timeline of Muhammad's life that might be helpful for you. The last important event, as you can see here, is the conquest of Mecca, or the victory of Muslim of the Battle of Hunain, which took place in 630. And 2 years later, in 632, Muhammad died after he performed his last pilgrimage, or farewell pilgrimage, the term that we often know. So the question is, how do we know, the story of Muhammad's life? What sources can we use to reconstruct the life of the Prophet? How confident we are that the information contained in those sources is reliable? So let's begin with, with the first extant source about the life of Muhammad that we know it today. So the first source that we know it today, which is extant today, is the one composed by Ibn Ishaq, who died in 150 of the Hijrah, of the Islamic calendar, or 767 of the Common Era. Ibn Ishaq was born in Medina, And as you can see from the reading, because of the conflict between him and one of the most prominent scholars in Medina, Malik bin Anas, the founder of Maliki School of Thought, Ibn Ishaq decided to leave Medina, and he worked for the Abbasid Caliph. So he authored a book. It's called Sirah, Sirah Nabawiyah, meaning the biography of the Prophet, and he wrote it as a gift to that he presented to one of the Abbasid Caliph at the time. So before I talk about that, this Sirah, or his work, was only known to us through the transmission of Ibn Hisham, who lived almost 2 generations later. So Ibn Ishaq's own work is not extant today, but rather what we have today is the one edited by Ibn Ishaq. Interestingly, that Ibn Ishaq, who died in 833, he didn't receive or transmitted his material from Ibn Ishaq himself, but rather from Ibn Ishaq's student. His name is Al-Bakkai. Right? So this caused some problem with regard to the reliability of Ibn Ishaq's work. Does Ibn Hisham transmit Ibn Ishaq's work faithfully, or does he omit certain thing or modify certain thing? Interestingly, that Ibn Hisham himself admitted in his introduction that he omits certain thing, certain report about Muhammad's life that he sees as not acceptable to Muslim in his time. So now we can identify some problem with the Muslim sources. The first is that those sources were written much later after the death of the Prophet, more than 100 years after the death of the Prophet. As you can see that Ibn Ishaq died in 150, meaning that more than 100 years. But even more importantly, that Ibn Ishaq's work is not extant today in its original form, but the one that was edited by someone who lived 2 generations after him, by Ibn Hisham. Meaning that the earliest work on the life of the Prophet that we have today was written more than almost 200 years after the death of the Prophet. For historical critical approach, this is problematic because one of the most important principles for historians to follow is that do not use sources which are not contemporary with the event they purport to record. So since the Muslim sources were written more than 100 years or 150 years, then these sources are not contemporary. So using the Muslim sources contradict the very principle that any historian should follow. That is the first problem. And the second problem is that those sources contradict each other. If we examine, how certain events during Muhammad's time is presented in different sources, we will see some contradiction and inconsistencies. I think the reading show you examples how different sources present the specific event during Muhammad's life differently. Some contradictions seem to be trivial issues, but others are quite serious. So the question that historians might ask themselves, when they encounter this type of contradiction, which version, which of the report is the correct one? if you encounter contradicting report, conflicting report, which one is the reliable one? The one that reflect what has happened. This is what history is all about, right? What has actually happened. So it is not possible that all those conflicting reports are correct. So the option is whether one of them is correct, all of them are wrong. As you can see from the reading, that um, one of the critical or skeptical scholars argue, whatever angle you approach the Muslim sources, what you will find is nothing more than a debris of obliterated past. So remember who says this? It was Patricia Kroner, a scholar of early Islam from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. And as you may know, that Patricia scholar, Patricina Kroner, along with his colleague Michael Cook, they published a book entitled Hackerism, in which they try to reconstruct the emergence of Islam not on the basis of the Muslim sources, but rather on the basis of non-Muslim sources altogether. They argue because the Muslim sources are not reliable, they cannot be used to reconstruct the life of the Prophet or how Islam emerged. So for scholars like Patricia Kroner, when when we encounter a conflicting report, then perhaps none of those is correct. None of those reflect the historical event. That's the second problem. The third problem is that oftentimes those those narrative about the life of the Prophet reflect later development. As I mentioned earlier, that Ibn Ishaq wrote his book as a gift to one of the Abbasid caliph. It is no surprising that they tend to present the ancestor of the Abbasid Caliphate with high regard. So one example of this is that the way he present Al-Abbas. Al-Abbas was Muhammad's uncle, who also is the ancestor of the Abbasid Caliphate. So you see, the name Al-Abbas. So by any standard, Al-Abbas was not good Muslim. He was not an ideal Muslim. He participated in the fighting in the war against the Prophet. He participated in the battle of Badr. He did not accept Islam until later in his life. Only few months before the conquest of Mecca that he accepted Islam. By any standard, he was not good Muslim. But if you read how Ibn Ishaq present Al-Abbas, he says that Al-Abbas was the one who accompanied the Prophet during the pledge in Aqaba. So Al-Abbas, who was not believer, is described by Ibn Ishaq as someone who advised Muhammad during the pledge of Aqaba. You see how Ibn Abbas is presented in Ibn Ishaq work in such a way, because Ibn Ishaq wrote his book as present to the Abbasid Caliph. It's quite understandable. So, but not only that, as I already mentioned, also that Ibn Ishaq tend to censor or omit certain things that according to him was not acceptable during his lifetime. Those narratives that can be seen as contradicting the concept of the infallibility of the Prophet. So there is no doubt that the sources, the Muslim sources, include some, they are very tendencies. So the question now is, how can we solve this problem, the tendenciousness of the Muslim sources? that seem to reflect later development, which seem to appeal to certain ideology or theological issues. So traditional scholars, despite of this tendency or tendencies of the source, they still claim that the Muslim sources contain the historical kernel. If we can identify, which part of the sources tendencies, which parts are not, we can identify the kernel of history, right? So one way to distinguish between whether the sources are tendencies or not is to look at the political aspect of it. So one British scholar, Montgomery Watt, argued that if we can get rid of the political aspect of the biography of the Prophet, we can reach the kernel of history. So meaning that the Muslim sources can be seen as reliable if we can identify the political aspect of it. And Muslim scholars themselves, they prefer to use the isnad, meaning chains of transmission, in order to verify which reflect facts or which reflect myth, right? However, skeptical scholars, the revisionists, argue that even the isnad itself emerged much later in the Islamic tradition. The isnad, or the chain of transmission, was not widely used in the first century of Islam. So scholars like John Wansbrough, for instance, as you can see from the reading, British scholar, well, he was born in the United States, but he spent his academic career at the University of London. He argued that the isnad of the chains of transmission cannot be seen as a tool for historical research, because that isnad itself was not widely used until the year 200. So that's what makes this issue about the sources quite exciting. Maybe just two more points, then I will stop, and then we can have a discussion. The question then, can we bridge the gap, right, between the life of the Prophet and the sources? If the sources that we have come from Ibn Hisham, for instance, can we make sure that Ibn Ishaq transmit from Ibn Hisham? If that can be proven, then can we trace the sources of Ibn Ishaq to his teacher, Ibn Shihab Az-Zuhri, who died in 741, right? If that can be done, we can shorten the gap. Then the question is, can we even trace the sources of Az-Zuhri to his teacher, Urwah bin Zubair, who died in 713, who lived in the first century of Islam? If that can be proven, then the Muslim sources can be seen as emerging from the first century of Islam. I hope that I have been able, in the reading at least, to show you that there are some common grounds among the so-called traditionalists and skeptics, or traditionalists and revisionists. Even traditionalists, admit today that the Muslim sources had problems. There is no doubt about that. They were written much later. Contra introduction seem to reflect later development. However, they still believe that there are some historical kernels. The skeptics or the revisionists, although they cast doubt about the historicity of certain report about the life of the Prophet, they admit that certain report can be reliable, can be traced back to the first century of Islam. So despite of this disagreement and debate between traditionalists and revisionists, but you can see some common ground now, that yes, both traditionalists and revisionists agree that there are problems, that the reason why we have to approach the Muslim sources critically. but also that those aspects of the report can be traced back to the first century, something that even skeptics or revisionists tend to admit now. So there are some common ground that emerge because of their serious dialogue between these two camps, the camp of traditionalists and also revisionists. I think I can stop there, and then I'm very looking forward to
Thank you so much, Dr. Mun'im. Thank you so much for the great informative presentation. A lot of the questions that my students shared with me prepared, your presentation already took care of them, but I would like to pause the recording for more questions or any comments from students, both campuses. Again, thank you so much for your sharing, for sharing your time, your expertise, and your new book with us today at Nebraska Lincoln. Thank you so much. And I'm pausing the recording.